I could feel the blood trickle from my fingertips on both hands, but I felt no pain. I was aware they were bleeding, but I felt no motivation to take any action to stop it. The tones echoing from my guitar were intoxicating. I felt drunk from it. No, that's not the right word. I felt almost erotic. My right leg had become damp below where my guitar rested, while my fingers danced a glorious waltz across the strings. I often used a pick to strum the strings, but this melody required my fingers. When I sat down to play earlier that evening, I was using my pick. It was my favorite one. I loved the thin picks, the ones that brushed themselves so easily up and down the strings. I had broken many of them over my career as a budding musician, but this one had stood the test of time. Where is it now? I wondered briefly as my mind escaped the melodic trance for a single moment before I was once again ensnared by the haunting tune. I could hear my guitar weeping and nothing more. Brief thoughts would enter my brain before it was enraptured once more by the sounds reverberating against the walls. The daily soundtrack of cars passing by below my fourth-floor window did not put a dent in my focus. They didn't even resonate in the room anymore, as long as my strings were dancing beneath my fingertips. I could feel the euphoria burst from within me as my song neared its climax. The walls seemed to soundlessly vibrate before me as the notes exploded from my touch. For a moment, the entire world existed only in this building, only in this room. I heard it in my head as though I had just given birth to a blissful and beautiful joy that could reshape reality itself. The walls of my tiny apartment shuddered violently as cracks formed across them with light bursting from behind. The light shone colors I had never before imagined, even in my most vivid, drug-fueled dreams.
"Come closer,"
a voice echoed from beyond the boundaries of my bedroom. I just continued to play, the music guiding my every motion, bending my fingertips to their will. The cracks widened, sprinkling the carpet with powdered drywall, but it would not interrupt my unyielding focus. An eerie yet strangely entrancing mist crept through the splits in my walls, weaving around me like the tendrils of some glorious entity. This only fueled the passionate waltz my fingertips performed. There was such a blissful sensation to this entire experience, as though the fog creeping around me and into my lungs was the most potent drug I'd ever encountered.
"Break through,"
the voice called out.
"You're almost there. You're almost here. Just..."
I felt a sudden pain run across my arm as the low E string on my guitar snapped, slashing me across the back of my wrist. I shook my head as I sat in my chair with my guitar resting upon my leg. I was confused, feeling lost for a moment. I was strangely surprised to see my dingy and undamaged walls looking back at me. I was even more taken aback when I looked down to see my shredded fingertips and blood-soaked jeans, the crimson puddle on the floor beneath my feet. There was also the slight gash across the back of my wrist from where my broken string had caught it. I propped my scratched and chipped old guitar on its stand and made my way to the bathroom to wash my fresh wounds. I winced as I held my fingertips under the warm water. I reached up to pull open the mirror to reveal my medicine cabinet behind. I pulled a bottle of rubbing alcohol and felt a rush of pain spike through my left arm as the liquid trickled over his fingers. I switched hands, repeating the process, causing fresh pain to surge through my right hand. I whipped my towel from my towel rack, gripping it tightly with both hands in an attempt to cease the blood flow as I slowly strolled back to my living room. I felt my jaw unhinge as I fully took in the sight of the wide puddle on the floor. I didn't feel lightheaded or queasy from blood loss or anything, but it seemed a substantial amount had leaked from my fingers. How long was I playing for? I wondered as I walked to my bedroom to check the time on my alarm clock. 7 a.m.? I said aloud to my otherwise empty apartment. Taking a mental note of where my day had taken me before making it back to my apartment that day, I knew I had arrived back there around 2 in the afternoon. I only had 2 classes to attend that day, and I had turned down Jeremy's offer to hit up a bowling alley, as I wanted to practice on my instrument. Had I really been playing this whole time? Today should be Saturday, if I wasn't mistaken, though my internal clock was quite shaken up to say the least. I suddenly realized how exhausted I was, having completely skipped rest to play my guitar. Once the blood flow had ceased enough, I wrapped gauze around each fingertip, something that grew much more difficult with each finger that became more padded. Once that was out of the way, I practically fell onto my bed, the exhaustion finally grabbing a hold of me. I was asleep before my head hit the pillow. Somewhere in my subconscious, I could still hear that unsettling voice that called out to me again, encouraging me to come closer, and closer still. Though slumber had already claimed me by this point, my dreams guided me somewhere new. I sat on my chair, staring out into a crowded theater of faceless people. They chanted my name like a theme as I looked upon them, revering me like a saint or a god. I held my guitar in my lap, but it was not my own. It was a glossy, shimmering red that looked as though it rippled beneath my touch. The crowd fell silent as I ran the back of my forefinger across the strings. A vibrant aura emitted from the instrument as I played the familiar melody. It looked like the effect of the blistering heat on the pavement, as if reality itself, true reality, and not the shadow within which we live, was hiding in plain sight behind a translucent veil. As my haunting tune progressed, audience members began to moan, still crying out my name. Once my song finally came to a close, and I raised my eyes to look upon my adoring audience, the theater was empty with the exception of a lone individual, a man with black eyes, wearing a long red robe, standing alone in the center of the theater. His face was a light gray, and his long flowing hair a shining jet black. He walked slowly towards the stage, clapping his hands as he approached. His smile was wide, almost meeting the pointed ears on either side of his face. His gaze made me feel cold as a spike of pain ran the length of my spine. I looked from his eyes to the rest of the deserted room. It was then that I saw the blood. It lined every seat in the house, still trickling down the aisle to where the man now stood, directly in front of the stage. His smile became more menacing as a frown began to line his brow. He opened his mouth wide, wider than possible for any man or even beast. It emitted a sound such as I have never heard. I dropped my guitar to the floor of the stage and clutched my ears. Blood ran between my fingers as pain echoed from my ears, as though something were growing within them. I screamed out in fear and impending madness in equal measures. I was still screaming as I sat straight up in my bed, my trembling flesh lined with cold sweat. I grabbed my ears, expecting to find my hands soaked with blood, but there was nothing on them when I looked at them. I did notice, though, that the gauze had slipped from several of my fingers, revealing no trace of the injuries I had sustained the previous night and day. I pulled the rest of the bandages away to see only my unblemished and calloused fingertips. I turned my hands and saw that the scratch from my broken string still lay across the back of my wrist. I felt groggy from sleeping. I looked at my alarm clock to see that I had slept for a good 8 hours, as it was approaching 3 o'clock. I may as well do something with my day, I thought, as I staggered to my kitchen to grab a bottle of water. Upon seeing my beat-up guitar resting safely on its stand, surrounded by only my ready carpet with no bloodstains in sight, I questioned the damage to my fingers in the first place. I knew I had wrapped them up the previous night, but maybe my weary mind was overreacting to simple surface wounds. That seemed more logical than shredded flesh healing overnight. The string on my guitar was indeed broken, though. I would need to buy more strings soon, as not only did my music class demand that my instrument be as present as I, but I had my first paying gig coming up the next weekend. It wasn't exactly a major venue or anything, just a local bar, but it wasn't always easy for a solo instrumentalist to get a paying job, without a singer anyway. Still, even if the paycheck wouldn't be the most impressive, I loved the idea of finally introducing my music to the world, or a handful of locals getting plastered in this case. My mother and stepfather still sent me money weekly to help my academic path move along well, so the money wasn't a huge deal to me. That combined with my part-time job made most of the essentials easy enough to handle. Sure, I couldn't afford the prettiest of apartments or the nicest of furnishings, but everything I needed could be covered easily enough. Today, that necessity would be fresh guitar strings. Though my guitar was old, the music it was capable of producing was sublime. I thought of myself as quite the experienced musician, but I had never been able to reproduce notes as beautifully on any other instrument. I had played around with plenty of music store fodder over my years, but even the most expensive of them could never match the sound of mine. Perhaps it was all in my head. It was my father's guitar, after all. There's no denying that sentimental value can alter perceptions. He was a masterful player in his day. I remember spending so much of my youth crouched on the floor in front of him, watching his fingers make love to the strings. As I recall, he picked up the old guitar from a local pawn shop that only lingered in our hometown for a few weeks at best. He said it was a classy joint for a peddler of used belongings, though he hadn't paid much for the already worn-down instruments, $30 to $40 if memory serves. He mentioned that many of the items upon the elegant shelves looked to have a hefty price tag attached. Maybe that's exactly why it didn't stick around for long, not in such a small town as the one I grew up in. The second my dad strummed his forefinger across the strings, though, he knew that he had purchased something special that day. We weren't particularly well off, often making canned meals last as long as possible, but even when he and my mother would part with one belonging or another, selling off once treasured things to make ends meet, he would never even think about giving up his prized guitar. Yeah, it looked like a ratty old thing to most, but I'd never heard any instrument produce as beautiful music as this one. As sad as it is to say, life did get easier for my mom and I after he passed. His life insurance all but eradicated the financial issues, but I don't think she ever fully recovered from it. And nor did I. He died in a vehicular accident when I was around 13 years old, but before he took that ill-fated trip, he passed the guitar to me as an early birthday present. My birthday was still a solid 3 months away, and as well received as the gift was, felt out of place and a little awkward. I remember it well, even though many years have gone by since that day. I was eating my cereal and watching cartoons as my father made his way through the front door. He didn't have to go to work that day, but he spoke of errands he had to do, responsibilities that he could not put off any longer. He seemed to wait outside for some time before he would even approach his car. Curiously, I walked through the door to make sure all was well. I found him just standing there, staring out into the world. We lived in a generic suburban neighborhood, so there were little in the way of sights to distract the mind. I stood in the doorway looking up at my father for a few moments before he took notice of my arrival behind him. He turned to me, laying his hand on my shoulder, wearing the smile of a proud father. He gestured with a tilt of the head for me to follow him back into the house, and I strolled behind him as he made his way into his bedroom. I was generally only allowed in his room when he was playing his guitar, and I assumed he meant to play me something before he left for the afternoon. I went to assume my usual position on the floor before my father turned back to face me, holding his guitar out toward me. Even back then it had damage, but that never affected how it sounded. The scars actually made it more enchanting to me, It bore no brand name on its headstock, only a symbol embossed in gold. It was as though my dad were handing me Excalibur itself. In my mind, I took a knee before him as an enrobed king laid the fabled weapon into my outstretched hands.
"She's all yours now, kiddo,"
he said, that proud smile still lining his lips.
"Treat her well, and allow her to treat you the same."
He tousled my hair as a single tear made its way down my face, eventually dropping down with a minuscule splash to the waiting instrument. My father then left me standing in his room, slightly in shock and gripping the guitar tightly as he made his way back outside. I heard the engine from his Jeep roar to life before the sound of the engine faded to silence as he drove away. That was the last time I saw him, though my memories of him still hold strong in my mind's eye. I don't own a vehicle outside of the bicycle I often use to traverse the grounds of my local college. I would have to take the subway to make my way out of the city and take the bus from there to reach the Biblioteca music store in the small town of Lynchburg that sat right outside the border of the city. According to rumors I had heard, this town had built itself up back over 7 decades or so. Supposedly, back in the 50s, a tragedy had left hundreds dead, almost the entire population. I looked into it once, back when I had just started college. I couldn't track down any news articles or evidence of tragic events, other than the usual skeletons just about any town has in its closets. I spoke with some of the residents at local diners and the like, places I would frequent on my occasional visits, but even the older folks had little knowledge about such things, only that something terrible occurred here many years ago. Regardless of any likely bullshit urban legends, it was the only store remotely closed that kept Giovanni strings in stock. There were a few online retailers that would carry them, but I needed them quickly. My father swore by the Giovannis, and they were the only strings he would allow to grace his precious instrument, and I promised myself I would never allow another string to weave itself across her. It took around 2 hours for me to finally arrive at the Biblioteca. It was an old building that stood alone in the center of a parking lot away from any other building. The design of the small store always seemed more akin to an old bookstore or some sort of hidden trove to acquire ancient scriptures or even delve into the occult. It felt ancient and dusty, though it was never unclean or unkempt. I approached the shelf that would always hold the Giovanni strings to find it bare. No strings of any kind lay upon it. My heart quickened slightly as I made my way around the interior of the building in search of the silver-plated copper strings. After searching to no avail, I approached the man behind the counter. He was always there, every time I had arrived at the store in search of strings, or anything else that may strike that day's fancy. He would be on his stool behind the wooden counter. His fingers were heavily calloused due to decades of pressing the strings to the fretboard. He would drum his fingertips on the counter as if he were a living metronome, and it sounded as if he were striking it with tiny drumsticks. He knew my face, though not my name. Honestly, I had no idea what his name was either. I approached the slender, bearded man and asked if he may have any Giovannis in the back. My heart was still beating hard. It felt a little irrational to have become so worked up over guitar strings, but I would not lay another brand strings across my girl. Moments later, the old man came back from the room behind him, holding several packs of different gauges of Giovanni strings. The racing in my chest finally calmed, and I gestured toward the light gauge strings. I asked if he had 2 packs, as it would save me a trip should this happen again anytime soon. He asked me kindly if I could lay the other packs on the bare shelf, and he retreated to the back room once more. I would have bought more than 2 packs, but these strings were not cheap. My guitar may look worn to the untrained eye, but she deserved the best, and the best is never cheap. Night was falling when I walked the stairs to reach my apartment. During my quest, a friend had sent me a text inviting me to a party at one of the apartment complexes closer to the school. I replied that I had plans for the night and could not weasel my way out of them, though I hated to miss the festivities. He seemed to buy it enough to leave me be. It's not that I was in any way antisocial or adverse to the idea of drinking myself into some random girl's bed. I just had to take care of the woman closest to my heart before I could attend to another's desires. She was still resting soundly on her stand when I arrived back in my home. I instantly began removing the old strings, taking care not to scratch her any more than she was already. I found her scars beautiful, truth be told. They made her as unique in body as she was in soul. After removing the old strings, wrapping them around each other to make for easy disposal, I began threading the new ones. One by one, I glided them from the bridge, up her slender neck and across the nut. I slid them softly through the tuners and tightened them slowly. It was a dance we had performed many times over the years, but it made that first strum across the fresh strings ever so sweeter. I caressed my guitar softly and began to brush the strings with my fingers. I had forgotten to grab some new picks at the store, and I'm sure I had some around here somewhere. Though the song I had played in my presumed dream had slipped from my memory, I knew I could only reach it again with my fingertips. Time seemed irrelevant as my girl began to weep her sweet song. My fingers were prisoners to her will. Though my father was a blues man, I was more partial to the classics. Toccata and Fugue by Bach was my go-to warm-up, and I would often follow with Winter from Vivaldi's Four Seasons. Every note had become pure muscle memory, and I would pluck every chord with my eyes closed to fully embrace the melody. I played through the classics before improvising with my eyes still tightly shut. Though I was pleased with the music I produced, I never came close to the haunting tune from my dream. I couldn't even recall how it went, but I knew what it wasn't. After some hours, I placed my girl back on her velvet-lined stand and gave in to slumber. Over the following week, I continued to practice every night, still seeking out that blissful tune that had slipped through my fingers. While I could not relocate the path that led me to that mesmerizing melody, I did produce some new works. As the days drew closer to my first paying gig, I began to grow quite nervous about playing in front of others, even if it was likely to be some half-lit strangers who only barely paid attention. Still, as I would caress my girl each night, tracing my fingertips down her slender neck, I felt more confident that I would at least not embarrass myself. As predicted, there were maybe only 10 to 12 patrons at most in the local tavern when I took the stage. I said a few words introducing myself and the nature of tonight's entertainment, but only a couple of the potential audience members even glanced up from their drinks. When I began to play, though, when that first light strum echoed across the small and somewhat dingy room, every single eye in the joint became glued to the stage. As each piece concluded, the applause was more enthusiastic than the last. More customers came strolling in, some joining those who had already claimed a table, and others finding their own places to sit. But everyone who walked through the door immediately cut their eyes to me, or to my girl, anyway. It would seem that she had a way of entrancing others, just as she consumed my thoughts, when she was within my loving embrace. By the time I reached the climax of my performance, my fingertips having taken the wheel for some 3 hours by this point, every seat in the house was filled, while many more guests leaned up against walls or sat in the aisles. My hands caressed the shapely body of my one and only love, stroking her gently as her tune began to erupt. I heard a series of audible gasps as the intro to the familiar melody began to cascade against the walls, vibrating them as it had at my apartment what felt like months ago. Minutes trickled by as the shadowed denizens inhabiting the dimly lit tavern began to embrace one another, shedding tears over what their ears were witnessing. I was so zoned out myself, my senses enraptured by the magnificent tones, I didn't even notice the moaning at first. When I did, though, when I realized that the sobs and moans were no longer of awe and admiration, but of ecstasy, My own seduced subconscious almost violently collided with reality once more. I felt my jaw unhinge as I allowed my eyes to focus on my surroundings. Though I had never personally witnessed such a thing before, it didn't take any experience on the subject to understand that I was witnessing a full-on orgy in this otherwise downtrodden bar. Sweat-lined flesh was smeared against sweat-lined flesh as both strangers and friends thrust against one another. Clothes were strewn across the floor while some garments hung from ceiling fans and countertops. They kept going, even after my fingers became paralyzed by the perplexing sight. Even after I got to my feet to begin packing up my shit as hastily as I could, not one person took note of the night's entertainment having concluded. Of course, it would seem that their own chosen entertainment had claimed their full attention. As I began to turn my back to the crowd, heading toward the exit, I felt the strange sensation of being watched. Considering I had played for a crowd of, far too adoring fans for some hours, with each eye glued to me before, it seems like it shouldn't have felt strange to have someone watching me now, even if they were otherwise preoccupied at the time. I almost let my guitar case slip from my grasp when I noticed the lone, fully clothed individual standing by the front entrance. It took me a second to recognize the old guy who manned the counter at the music store, but the way he just stood there, unblinking, gazing through my eyes and into my skull, I felt the most bizarre sensation of irrational fear. At the same time, though, something I didn't realize at the time was that I almost felt the most accepting and inviting warmth in his stare, as though I could feel loving arms embracing me as I stood there, trembling on the stage. Snapping back to my senses, I had to assume that I was growing influenced by whatever had led to the impromptu orgy at the dingy old bar. Breaking my gaze from the one who still glared at me, I fled the stage and got the hell out of there, not looking back. Okay, I might have taken a quick glance or three as I made my way to the backstage exit, but come on, I'm a college kid for Christ's sake. When the chilled night air embraced my still trembling flesh, I let out a shaky sigh, feeling utterly confused about what was going on in that bar. I'd only stepped foot in that place maybe twice before that night, so I had to assume that this was not an uncommon practice in this particular back alley tavern. I'd heard rumors about such places before, but I always assumed this was one of those bored rich people sort of activities. Don't get me wrong, I'm as open-minded as anyone, but aggressively getting it on with a bar full of strangers? Call me a prude or whatever, but that ain't for me. I've always been more of a one-on-one kind of guy, but each to their own, I suppose. I was still mentally checked out over the taxi ride back to my apartment, honestly considering whether or not to even contact the owner of the joint the following day. Being my first paying gig, I wasn't exactly certain of when they would tally up the bill, but was honestly tempted to just let it go, just to avoid whatever awkward conversations may come from it. When I got back to my home, I stashed my girl back on her perch, gently stroking her slender neck before heading to clean myself up. I stood in the shower for what felt like hours, still feeling strangely filthy by the time I finally stepped back out. After that, I just dropped onto my bed, passing out within seconds. My eyes opened to see my room filled with sunlight. I hadn't paid any attention to what time I gave in to sleep the night before, but I felt no exhaustion or desire to remain in my bed. Most mornings would find me awakened by the all-too-familiar sound of my bellowing alarm clock, but few things were as satisfying as waking up only after the desired hours of rest had been fulfilled. Filled with energy and a strange sense of purpose, I jumped from my bed to meet the new day. Though my dreams had once again nestled themselves deeply within my subconscious, I was filled with drive. I would return to the biblioteca once more. While I was primarily more curious to find out how the shop's proprietor had found himself at the bar in which I performed the previous night, I also felt this bizarre compulsion to talk with him. There was something behind his gaze as we stared at one another, but I couldn't quite figure out what. I had never taken my treasured guitar with me on my previous trips. I had rarely taken it anywhere outside of my school and whatever home I resided in at the time. Perhaps I was afraid of further damaging her, or maybe I was just concerned that thieves may see the value in it as much as I. Regardless of any of that, she would be my passenger on this day. After all the years and all the build-up and anticipation, we would finally be experiencing our first real date. She was my lover, and I longed for her caress. I sat on the subway seat with my arms wrapped snugly around the hard-shell case that contained my guitar. I held her close to my body and kept my grip on her tight. I followed suit as I boarded the bus, only breaking my grasp for a moment to pass my loose change to the driver upon entering. To onlookers, I may have appeared similar to a paranoid old woman clutching her handbag, wary of suspicious individuals in the vicinity. I paid no attention to the people perched in the surrounding seats. My focus was on my destination. The trip to the old music store seemed to last an eternity, though time passed in its usual fashion. I stepped from the bus and continued to keep my grip tight as I strolled the sidewalks to arrive at the store. Standing before the door, I felt a rush of adrenaline spike through my chest. I extended an arm from the shell that surrounded my girl to push the door inward, causing the small bell hanging above the entrance to jingle in recognition of my arrival. I heard the drumming of the owner on his countertop fall silent as I approached him. Though I had been rehearsing my questions over the long ride here, I was no longer concerned with my queries. I just glared at the man as he greeted me with a slight smirk. I felt my own lips spread into a smile. My heartbeat still hastened, with an unusual but not unwelcome warmth spreading through my chest. I crouched down to lay the case on the floor, snapping its clasps loose and raising its lid. I stood to meet the old bearded man's eye again, holding my guitar outstretched toward him with both arms. He looked to the guitar before shifting his eyes to meet my gaze. His grin spread wider as he raised from his stool upon which he had been resting. He grew taller as he straightened his posture, while his clothes began to transform before my eyes. His red and black plaid shirt shimmered slightly as the colors bled together like pools of paint drifting into one. The fabric stretched, cascading to the floor like curtains being let down. The sleeves widened and fell across his wrist, while the small black buttons engorged with the darker tones flaking away like peeling paint to reveal glossy gold and intricately detailed snaps. Within mere moments, he stood before me at least 3 feet taller than before, wearing a vibrant crimson robe with streams of black like rippling waves. A black cape fell from his upturned collar, spilling across his back like a stream of ink, while a large and elegant book formed under the grip of his left arm, with his hand clasped around its base. The book, along with his cape and collar, bore a familiar symbol, the same that was etched into the headstock of my guitar. He raised his hand to his face, which had become blank and expressionless as he wrapped his fingers around his mouth. He pulled his face away from his head, causing a subtle orange light to shine from behind it. The detached face appeared to have turned solid, like a wooden mask, as he released it from his grasp. It floated to the side of his head as a multitude of other male and female faces appeared around him. They circled his head as if they were the rings of Saturn or many moons orbiting the illuminated aura that was once ahead. He lay his hand on my father's guitar, inspiring the cracks and scratches to melt away, revealing an almost shimmering red, not indifferent from his fresh set of clothes. There were no more scars on the pickguard from the decades of playing. Even the now glossy black leather strap looked brand new. The symbol, which had once been gold paint, now glowed brightly from the light that shone from within. The wooden counter that had stood between the many-faced man and I had vanished at some point, while my eyes were glued to this mesmerizing individual, and we stood before a flight of stairs that led upward to where more light was shining down. We walked side by side and hand in hand up the wide steps until we reached the roof of the building. Biblioteca now stood 3 times as tall as it had before I entered that day. It felt almost as if it were a temple of sorts. There was a golden throne atop the music store that seemed to reflect the entire world around it, as though it were meant to project deeply into the universe. The towering man beckoned me forward to where the roof gave way to the world below, before he took his place on the glistening throne. Hordes of people had begun to gather in front of the building, while the entire city around us had fallen silent as more wandered closer. Without hesitation, I ran my fingers across the strings wound tightly across my instrument, as the flock of people looked on with tears welling in their eyes. My fingers began their dance, but not to the classics. They found their way on pure instinct as I closed my eyes to become lost in their song. The notes echoed across the land in front of me, even with no amplifier attached. Within moments, I heard the ecstatic moans from below, but I would not look to my adoring crowd, keeping my eyes closed tightly to fall into my song completely.
Yes.
That familiar voice murmured from somewhere almost out of reach of my senses.
Keep going. You're so close.
I could feel my extremities tingling, my heart racing as my sweet melody progressed, nearing the point at which I had lost it before. Voices called out from the base of the enlarged shop, whining in shared pleasure. Their cries were as intoxicating as my music, but I would still not relent.
Break through.
The cracks began to form across the roof upon which I performed, and from the tarmac below. The vibrant light shone from whatever wonders lay within, that subtle mist creeping through the splits in reality. Again, I could feel the flesh tearing from my fingertips as I strummed more aggressively, my song cascading into newfound territory. Tears spilled down my face as blood trickled from my hands. Sweat streamed from my brow as a satisfied chuckle blended with the notes bellowing from my seductive enchantress.
That's it.
The voice called out, cracking from the sheer emotion behind it.
Right there. Don't stop. Don't stop now.
A new sound joined the chorus of ecstasy from below, that of fabric tearing and liquid gushing to the concrete. I felt my concentration faltering, though my fingers were still entranced. I had blinked my eyes back open, allowing my jaw to unhinge once more, as my vision focused on the scene before me. The fog had grown thick, but somewhat translucent in a bizarre sort of way. It appeared to tint reality before me, but did not hide it from view. No fabric was tearing. All clothing had been shed, likely since that first moan erupted from the throng of listeners. Even while they dug their fingertips into each other and their own oozing bodies, they didn't scream. They didn't appear to be in any sort of pain at all, while layers of flesh, tissue, and viscera fell to the pavement. Eyes were gouged, guts were splayed open and strewed apart, jaws were torn away, limbs ripped and scattered to the ground. The only untouched area on anyone still standing were the ears. Fresh, entranced, and untouched ears, speckled in blood and gore, as one victim after another dropped lifeless before me. I still didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I didn't want to. I could feel my limbs turning gelatinous as my song reached its conclusion. The climax I had been unable to reach until this glorious moment. As I set my beautiful girl upon the velvet-lined perch to my side, the only sound accompanying my footsteps as I paced toward the edge of the roof was the applause from the one who guided me here. while I felt my guts churn at the grisly sight of hundreds upon hundreds of eviscerated civilians, I gave a humble bow to the dead before me. My senses spinning, I backed away from the edge, my lifeless legs betraying me. My senses abandoned me before my back met the ground beneath my feet, the hollow clapping fading from my faltering ears as everything fell silent and still. I awoke on the roof of the Biblioteca music store, feeling a rush of confusion at first. I barely recalled boarding the subway that day, and only vaguely held the memory of pushing open the door to the building of which I now lay atop. My head spun as I lifted myself up from the grainy surface beneath me, my body stiff and achy from resting on such a place. I staggered silently when I got to my feet, almost falling back to my knees from the sudden pounding in my head. It felt like a horrendous hangover caused by a night of eradicating personal demons through hours of alcohol ingestion. I saw my unblemished, gorgeous crimson guitar laying on the ground beside where I had awakened, momentarily confused by her lack of scars. Though it looked as though she had fallen from my grasp, laying sideways on the ground, there wasn't the slightest hint of any damage still, not even a scratch. I lifted her gently, rubbing my fingers across her in search of wounds, only finding myself growing more entranced by her beauty. Snapping my wavering senses back to the bizarre reality before me, I wrapped the strap around my shoulder before walking to open the door I hoped would lead me back to civilization. I descended the ladder that led from the roof back down to the store below, feeling a strange recollection of a staircase that I thought had led me here. I paced across the large but filthy attic of the building before strolling down the thin stairway that led back to the bottom. When I passed through the doorway back into the room with which I was more familiar, I gasped aloud, covering my mouth. Dust and cobwebs covered everything from the ceiling to the shelves and the counter that sat in front of the storage room. It looked as though no life had crossed this floor in decades, though the shelves and wall pegs still held so many untouched instruments and accessories. I paced through the aisles I'd walked through many times before, leaving fresh prints from my feet in the thick layer of dust on the floor. I found my equally as dust-speckled hardshell case lying closed before the counter. Dusting it off with my palms, I opened it to inspect its contents. After assessing the interior was clean enough to allow my girl to rest within, I snapped the shell shut around her. I walked out of the shop, turning to face it as I reached the end of the sidewalk. Regardless of how run down it was inside, it still caught me off guard to see the boarded-up windows and graffiti-covered exterior walls. It wasn't until a horn honked from behind me, alerting me to the fact that I had almost walked into the road, that I snapped out of my perplexed, pensive daze. I knew I had visited this shop many times over the years. How could it now be so dilapidated? The building I was glaring at looked as though it hadn't opened its doors in decades at least, aside from my exit from within. That in itself awakened a whole new array of questions. How did I get inside? How long was I in there? Why would I travel this far to reach a long-since abandoned shack of a shop? I wandered on, still confused as I looked upon the denizens of this otherwise striving town, going on with their lives. As I blinked my eyes against the vibrant sunlight, I saw glimpses of crimson pools lining the sidewalks and roads, only to see no such sights when I focused on my surroundings once more. When I reached the bus stop, I was still somewhat mentally vacant. Passers-by came and went, barely taking note of my unsettled expression as I took a seat on the bench. I wasn't sure when the bus may arrive, but the passage of time felt somewhat foreign to me at the time. I was still in a daze as I pulled my guitar from its confinement. I was barely aware when I brushed my fingers across the waiting strings. I hardly paid attention to the random strangers who gathered up as I plucked the silver copper beneath my fingertips. when passing vehicles attempted to stop, plowing through the crowd before me just to join my adoring audience. I didn't stop playing, nor did they stop listening. More entranced townsfolk approached, stepping on those who had already fallen, but I continued on. I still wouldn't stop, even when the blood began to spill. Some days after I finally returned to my apartment, I was still only vaguely aware of anything that had occurred since that bizarre gig at the local bar. I recalled playing some street music, wooing the crowd with my hypnotic melody, but little of the details of my performance. I received a phone call from one who had heard me play, one who was interested in sending me on tour, one who wishes to share my music with the world. The only one who has survived my performances. Most days, I only recall that I have played some shows, leaving the crowd speechless by the time I reached my grand finale. Other times that are growing far less frequent as time progresses, I remember all of it. I remember, well, knocking them dead. At these moments, I feel the burden of all of it. I feel the weight of the lives lost to my haunting tune. Every time this realization hits, though, it's forgotten by the time I take the motivation to do what I have to put an end to this. I've only toured my home state so far. I'll be branching out to the surrounding states very soon. Consider this your warning, as I do not know how much longer I'll have the conviction or desire to provide that much. It won't be long until the euphoria of my song mutes my senses again. I know now that when that happens, when it claims me, body and soul, I won't stop. I won't ever stop. I can't stop. I don't want to stop.